Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 210, Woodlands Estate. The homestead on Woodlands Estate in Crowlands, Victoria, has significance as an outstanding example of a substantial and elaborate 19th century homestead complex. It was originally selected in late 1841 as a sheep station by W.J.T. Clarke, known as Big Clarke, one of the colony's wealthiest landowners. It was originally 184,000 acres in size and was overseen by John Cayle Francis until his servant murdered him in 1842. John Francis is buried on the property. In 1913, in the Melbourne Australasian, there was a recollection of this tragedy. One occasionally comes across a tombstone in the bush, far away from the haunts of men or in the neighbourhood of some old station homestead, which has connected it with it much sad history. During the course of a recent visit to Woodlands, the old home of the McCulloch family, I came across a tombstone which was marked a grave under a giant gum tree close to the first homestead erected by the pioneers of the property. The inscription, which had recently been done up by the kindly thought of a resident member of the McCulloch family, set out in plain language the nature of a grim tragedy which had overtaken a young man in the early 1840s. This monument had been erected to the memory of John Cayle Francis, who was stabbed by John Maloney, a servant, on September the 17th and died on September the 19th, 1842, aged 27 years. The story of this tragedy, as told to me, was to the effect that the servant in question had committed the deed in revenge for a trick played upon him by the manager of the station. The servant, it seems, was a half-witted youth who, having grown tired of his employment, gave notice of his intention to leave and asked for a reference which he could make use of when seeking employment elsewhere. The manager wrote one out and handed it to him, and with this in his possession, the servant set out in search of fresh employment. Finding that the production of his reference did not shift matters forward anywhere, but rather appeared to emphasise the terms of refusal met with, the bearer of it began to suspect there was something wrong with the reference itself, the contents of which, being unable to read or write, he had not himself been able to master. Having had them explained to him by a third party, he realised that he had been made the victim of a somewhat stupid joke, that instead of a recommendation which would bring him employment, the reference was one that was calculated to obtain for him exactly the opposite result. It was neither more nor less than a blunt piece of advice to all whom it might concern to pass the bearer along elsewhere. As soon as the servant realised the nature of the document he'd been so carefully preserving, he set off back to interview the author of it. Arming himself with a broken shear blade, he forthwith made a murderous attack upon the manager, with the result indicated above on the tombstone. Whether the manager had deliberately played this trick upon his subsequent murderer as a practical joke, or had given the document as a piece of grim advice to his neighbours, it does not appear to have been known. In any case, whatever prompted its issue, the result must have long acted as a deterring influence to others who may have at times had dealings with half-witted employees. So who was W.J.T. Clarke? Well, he was William John Turner Clarke, and he was born on the 20th of April 1805 in Somerset, England. He was the second son of William Clarke of St Botolph, Aldgate, London, and his wife Sarah Turner of Western Zoyland, near Wells in Somerset. His farmer father died in 1819, and William was placed under the guardianship of his uncle Joseph. He began to work for a drover, taking cattle from Somerset to Smithfield, and he became a shrewd judge of livestock. At 21, the meat firm he was working with failed, and he pledged himself to be independent by making money, cautiously investing his savings in cattle and avoiding debt. In May 1829, he married Elizabeth Dowling, the daughter of George Pike Dowling, the rector of Puckington in Somerset, and Anne Biggs of an old and wealthy Bristol family. A weak chest and a congenitally malformed hip, as well as the prospect of new opportunities, induced him to emigrate to Australia, and he arrived in Hobart Town with his wife on the Deveron on the 23rd of December 1829. He first set up as a butcher and a meat contractor to the government in partnership with William Ladds, and for a time lived at the shop in Elizabeth Street, Hobart. Clarke later said that he had brought a capital of more than £3,000, But on the 11th of January 1830, when he applied for a land grant, he declared a capital of £1,410, a cow that cost him £25 in London, a bull not overvalued at £100, and a mare that would have been worth £200 in England. He explained to the land board that he'd rented a farm off Captain Briggs at Campbelltown and would have to put an overseer on his grant, and he was given 2,000 acres, which he located in the Campbelltown district and called Windfalls. In November 1831, he rented 8,000 acres and depastured 6,000 sheep and 800 cattle. He had a mortgage of £600 on his lovely bank properties near Jericho and £200 on a house at Campbelltown and an expected £800 for his wool clip. For thus employing his means and time, he asked for an extension of his original grant but was refused. According to a dispatch from Denison in January 1853, Clarke then owned 80,000 acres of land and rented 50,000 acres of it. His partnership with Lads was dissolved in 1834, and in the next year Clarke bought the rights of Munmurra Run near Cassilis in New South Wales, but he abandoned it after a few months, finding the drought and heat too severe for his health. In 1837 he shipped 1,600 ewes across the Bass Strait and took them first to Station Peak in the Yuyangs between Melbourne and Geelong, and then to the Dowling Forest near Ballarat. He acquired pastoral licences for 30,000 acres, and during the Depression in 1842, he set up a boiling down works, which realised a considerable sum of money. He then had 100,000 sheep in the Port Phillip district, and each year extended his land holdings. In 1850, under the Special Survey Clause of the Waste Lands Act, he successfully claimed 31,300 acres at 20 shillings an acre, and he located it near Sunbury, 40 kilometres from Melbourne. He next obtained the adjoining 31,000 acres under the Order in Council of 1847, both acquisitions displacing several pastoral licensees, and made a single property that stretched from Sunbury to the Sydney Road. This is how he got his nickname of Big Clarke, and he was also known as Moneyed Clarke. He was widely feared for his ruthless land hunger, but respected for his consummate ability in pursuit of fortune. He stuck with raising sheep as he felt that it was a better paying game, and to his great profit he introduced the Leicester sheep breed into Australia. The gold rush further increased his prosperity as meat sales boomed. Money received from his wool clips he lent at high interest to Australian import houses, and in time he acquired the reputation of being the wealthiest man in the country. Apart from visiting his mainland stations for shearing, Clarke lived in Tasmania until 1850, and in 1870 he made his home in Melbourne at Roseneath in Essendon. He represented the Southern Province in the Victorian Legislative Council from its inauguration in 1856 until 1870, except for 2 years, and he was an active member, although he was often absent through travel and ill health. With the years he put on weight and left much of his pastoral management to his sons William and Joseph, while he gave more attention to money lending, business investment and landed property in Melbourne. He was a director and substantial shareholder in the Colonial Bank and had large interests in other banks and insurance companies. His health declined, and in 1870 he became partially paralysed, but he insisted on attending directors' meetings, although it took 4 men to carry him to his carriage. He died at Roseneath on the 13th of January 1874, leaving an estate of some £2.5 million, besides 215,000 acres of freehold throughout Australasia. He bequeathed £800 a year to his wife, who lived apart from him, both in Tasmania and Victoria. Money was also left for a great-nephew in Tasmania. His properties in Victoria, worth about £1.5 million, went to his eldest son, William John. The second son, Thomas Biggs, was left out of the business affairs of his estate. His children were left £20,000 each, and he received only the rich pastoral property of Cornhill and 2 farms in Tasmania. Joseph, the youngest son, inherited 750,000 acres in South Australia, 50,000 acres in New Zealand, 50,000 acres in Tasmania, and a large share of his father's business interests. In 1855, Clarke sold Woodlands to William Hargraves and Richard Blackwood. Richard Blackwood was Scottish, and he'd arrived in Australia in the early 1850s. He later owned Hartwood Station in the Riverina near Jerilderie. In January 1881, it says the news which came by cable on Saturday from London of the sudden death of Mr. Richard Blackwood of the firm Dalgety Blackwood & Co. will be received with general regret. The deceased gentleman, who'd only entered into commercial pursuits at a comparatively recent date, had previously been engaged in squatting in the Riverina, but during the absence of his brother, Mr. John Blackwood, in England, he acted for him in conducting the business of the firm McMeekin, Blackwood & Co., and subsequently joined the firm of Dalgetty & Co. as a partner. He recently went to England with his family, and it was while visiting the steamer Protestant that he suddenly dropped dead while on board the steamer in the docks, aged 54 years. Richard Blackwood went into partnership with John Wilson initially for Woodlands in 1863, and then John Wilson took on the property in his own right. It was largely during the ownership of John Wilson from 1863 until 1888 when the property was transformed into one of the most notable rural estates in the Wimmera. Adjoining the original 1850s picturesque Gothic granite cottage was an early 1860s brick house. This was greatly extended and altered in 1868 into an elaborate two-storey Victorian Italianate-styled mansion to a design by the architects Crouch and Wilson. The 20-roomed house features ornate stained glass windows, being the work of Ferguson, Urey and Lyne of Melbourne, library bookcases by Thwaites of Melbourne, and elaborately and delicately modelled ceilings by Scurry and McKennell. John Wilson died in 1888, and the death was announced in the Ararat Advertiser and Chronicle for the Stawell and Wimmera districts on the 25th of December. Death of Mr. John Wilson of Woodlands. Yesterday, when it became known by telegram from Melbourne that Mr. John Wilson of Woodlands had died the previous morning in Melbourne, he's been in delicate health in months past, but only since leaving Ararat about a fortnight ago that symptoms of an alarming nature set in, and the news of his demise was quite unexpected. The deceased gentleman was under treatment in Fitzgerald's private hospital in Melbourne, where he underwent the operation of a lithotomy, but he gradually sank and died. Mr. Wilson was a native of Belfast, Ireland, and in early life was connected with the linen trade, but he came to the colony in the early days prior to the discovery of gold. The brothers Wilson, Charles, John, Alexander and Sir Samuel, may be justly ranked amongst the most energetic and successful of the pioneer colonists. A man of keen intelligence, liberal education and indomitable perseverance and energy, and a great strength of character, Mr. John Wilson soon carved out his fortune. At one time he was connected with Mr. Learmonth and subsequently had an interest in a station near Meredith. Later, he discovered a triangular piece of land between 3 stations in the Wimmera district, had never been licensed, and here the brothers located themselves and for some years managed their property most successfully. About 20 years ago, Mr. John Wilson purchased Woodlands Estate from Mr. Richard Blackwood, and this now has become perhaps one of the finest properties in this portion of Victoria, a very large sum of money having been spent on the mansion and grounds. Since purchasing Woodlands, Mr. Wilson's made 2 or 3 trips to Europe, but he finally settled on his estate several years ago, filling his house with the works of art collected during his travels. A liberal, kindly and courteous gentleman, he was esteemed by all who had the honour of his acquaintance, and his death will bring sorrow to many poor families who were the recipients of his kindly and unostentatious benevolence. He was also a most liberal supporter of the local hospital and benevolent asylum, the committee of which, when extending their buildings, appealed to him on several occasions and received his generosity of large sums. He leaves a widow and 2 daughters, one being the wife of Captain Bridges, RN. Wilson died at the age of 73, and his remains lie interred in the Ararat Cemetery, beside those of his late son, Alfred John Wilson, who met his death by a fall from his horse in October 1880. Upon Wilson's death, Woodlands, which was then reduced to 53,000 acres, was purchased by William McCulloch in 1889. McCulloch was the founder of the well-known firm McCulloch Carrying Company, but his years in public office as Minister of Defence and later Minister of Public Works and Minister of Health gave him his renowned reputation. William McCulloch was born on the 22nd of October 1832 in Wigtonshire, Scotland. In 1852 he migrated to Victoria to try his luck on the Mount Alexander goldfields. He soon turned to storekeeping and later travelled for McEwen & Co., one of the largest importers in Melbourne. The slow growth of railways prompted him to become a carrier and a forwarding agent and to found the firm, which became the largest of its kind in Australia. In 1860 he went to Europe and in 1861 married Catherine Vance Agnew. McCulloch returned to Victoria and opened a carrying business at Woodend, but soon moved the headquarters of the McCulloch Carrying Company to Melbourne. Within 15 years, the company had 20 branch offices throughout Victoria, the Riverina and South Australia, owned 5 Murray riverboats, and was an agent for about 10 more, and negotiated contracts with graziers on the Murray, Murrumbidgee and Darling rivers. The Riverina trade was funnelled into Echuca, the company's biggest branch office, to be forwarded by rail to Melbourne. McCulloch was also a founder and director of the Moama Deniliquin Railway, which opened in 1876. Railways later threatened to undermine his business, and he relinquished leadership of the company in 1886. His younger brother James helped to direct the company until it merged with Wright, Heaton and Co. in 1898. From 1870, William successfully owned 3 properties close to Melbourne. He invested heavily in stud cattle, sheep and horses imported from Europe. He specialised in Clydesdale horses, and his foundation stock of shorthorns consisted of 12 cows from the best herds in England. In 1878, McCulloch spent £30,000 in England on prize and bloodstock for 17 animals. He claimed to have spent fully 2 years in a critical examination of leading herds and in attending every shorthorn sale of importance. In the 1880s, he became interested in sheep and acquired Merton Park, a property near Clarke. In 1886, he bought Warbricken, a 63,000-acre property near Deniliquin, and in 1889, Woodlands, with one of the most imposing country homes in Victoria. McCulloch represented the Lonsdale ward in the Melbourne City Council in 1872 to 1876. Though pressed to accept the office of mayor, he declined since he wanted to visit Europe for health and business reasons. In 1880 through to 1903, he represented the Eastern Gippsland province in the Legislative Council. He made few speeches, but when debating, argued quietly, briefly, and yet diplomatically. He spoke his mind. He was not afraid to make clear and positive recommendations, and was especially knowledgeable about sheep, cattle, rabbits, railways, horse racing, betting, and women's suffrage. He was pro-federation. In 1890, he was a prominent founder of the Pastoralist Union in Victoria. In 1895, McCulloch was appointed Minister of Defence, and when the Boer War broke out, he organised and dispatched the first Victorian contingent. His transport work so impressed the governments of Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia that they transferred all the transit arrangements of their contingents to the Victorian government. In 1901, he chaired the Celebrations Committee for the Duke of York, who opened the Federal Parliament. He then became Minister of Defence and Health, and then Minister of Public Works and Health, until June 1902, when he was appointed to represent Victoria at Edward VII's coronation and to reorganise the office of the Victorian Agent General in London. In that year, he was appointed CMG. He resigned from the Legislative Council in 1903 to run for the Federal Senate, but lost and retired at Woodlands, where he died on the 4th of April 1909. His wife had died in 1894, and he had 3 sons and 3 daughters. Although delicate as a youth, McCulloch was tall and handsome, with very blue eyes and a well-clipped beard. Described in the press as accessible, genial and warm-hearted, he was always associated with integrity, honesty and probity, and charitable to a fault. During his ownership of Woodlands, he leased it in 1891 and 1892 to Lord Hopetoun, the Governor of Victoria and later the first Governor-General of Australia, as his summer residence. After McCulloch's death, the property was taken over by his sons. On the 13th of December 1913 in the Melbourne Australian, it has an article about Woodlands Estate. The old Woodlands Estate. The original property, which was purchased in 1889 by the late Mr. William McCulloch on the death of Mr. John Wilson, had an area of 56,000 acres in one long, narrow, compact block with a length of 30 miles. It is very evident that those who originally secured this property thoroughly understood the value of land and were not to be deterred by its heavy timbered condition from confining their attention to agricultural soil, pure and simple. Of the original estate, about 30,000 acres have been disposed of by sale and are now held in blocks of various sizes by farmers and small settlers. The balance has been distributed into 3 separate estates owned by the sons, Samuel, Colin and William McCulloch. As the eldest son, the first named, has the old home, one of the biggest and best country seats in Victoria, with about 5,000 acres. Colin McCulloch is located at the northern end of the old run with 12,000 acres around him, under the name of North Woodlands, forming a new home here a few years ago. Mr. William McCulloch is at the southern end of the old estate and has 9,000 acres. He is now engaged in forming his home in about the centre of his holding and is changing the name of it from South Woodlands to Dunnyworthy. North Woodlands is situated 20 miles east of Stawell, but it will be shortly brought into closer railway communication by the means of the line now in the course of construction running from Crowlands to Navarre. The line runs through South Woodlands within sight of the house, and a railway station is to be constructed about half a mile therefrom. About 5,000 acres of this property are given over to share farming in holdings of 200 acres in size, under occupation by 22 share farmers. The distance is too great for the extensive growing of any quantity of hay, but there is a fair acreage under oats, though the mainstay of all concerned is wheat. The principle of the share system here is the landowner takes 1/3 of the crop, gives the tenant the use of the land for 3 years. The tenant on his part finds all the labour and the means for putting in and taking off the crop. The same system which is pursued here in connection with share farming is also in vogue on the properties of the other two brothers. In addition to cropping operations, a crossbred flock of about 5,000 head of Lincoln Merino and Border Leicester Merino strain is run on the grasslands and on the stubbles after harvest. For the next 3 months, there's a probable carrying capacity of 10,000 head. Some of the old Lincoln blood, which was brought to such a high pitch of perfection by the late Mr. William McCulloch, is in evidence here, but with the exception of a young red shorthorn bull, I saw very little to remind me of the time when that gallant pioneer was making history with his shorthorns. The sporting tendencies of the owner and his family are made manifest on passing the entrance gate, finding oneself alongside an uncommonly well laid out coursing Plumpton, the only private one that I've ever come across in any part of Australia. Numerous greyhounds are provided with comfortable quarters at the back of the stable, and a Waterloo Cup and other trophies in the house testify to the measure of success attained. The stables contain 2 or 3 animals of considerable interest to the horse lover. Among these are very fine upstanding grey hunter Wait and See, which with Miss Alice McCulloch in the saddle has just completed a very successful round of the Victorian country shows. It is possible that he may be sent to England later on to take part in one of the grass counties, should the family again elect to visit the old homeland. As owner of Lieutenant Bill, winner of the Caulfield Cup of 1902 and other winners at picnic and other race meetings, Mr. Colin McCulloch can lay claim to experience on the turf, including a number of successes as an amateur rider. Woodlands is quite one of the most imposing country homes in Victoria, both in the matter of the house itself and of the gardens and ornamental grounds immediately surrounding it. The house was built in 1868 by the late John Wilson, a man of very sound ideas and of a high degree of culture, as the manner in which the grounds are laid out and the degree of taste displayed in connection with the whole homestead afford eloquent evidence. His residence here accumulated one of the finest private libraries in the Southern Hemisphere. Mr. Samuel McCulloch has recently entered into residence and intends to make Woodlands his personal home. Trees are 70 to 80 years old, are dotted about the grounds. Around the house, about 100 acres are given over to parks and ornamental grounds, garden walks and avenues, all of which in the past must have kept 10 or 12 men perpetually busy. A considerable measure of attention is still being devoted to the flower, fruit and vegetable gardens, or 2 as such can be kept under control by 4 or 5 men. The camphor wood trees show up an advantage, and one giant specimen of the tree of heaven, about 10 feet in circumference at the butt, is said to be one of the finest of its kind in the country. These and a very picturesque Japanese garden enclosure contribute a certain oriental effect to what otherwise bears the appearance of the surroundings of a stately old English home. Oaks and elms of 2 or 3 different kinds and other English trees, with an all-pervading background of pines, act as a shelter from the winds. The avenues and walks are laid out in a most attractive fashion, running at right angles to one another and in semicircular sweeps, among them being one very pleasing avenue effect, a row of elms in the foreground, of currajongs in the middle, and a background of pines. The Wimmera River runs at the foot of the gardens and skirts a flat of considerable extent composed of rich black alluvial soil. This forms a valuable grazing ground for high-class dairy herd, and when not interfered by floodwaters is capable of being extensively utilised for growing lucerne. The dairy herd is quite an economic feature of this property. A herd of 60 head was in full milk at the time of my visit, the work in connection therewith being undertaken by 2 young cousins of the proprietor. A fair-sized piggery is run in conjunction with the dairy, and these young men also have 300 acres under crop on shares. Of Woodlands proper, about 800 acres is being cropped on shares, and there's a crossbred flock of 2,000 head. The administration of the property is still in the hands of Mr. J. Whiteman, who had charge of it during Mr. McCulloch's absence in Europe. The same gentleman, a much-travelled and most interesting personality, also supervises the Dunnerworthy property owned by William McCulloch. And Dunnerworthy is an area of 9,000 acres, of which 2,000 acres are under cultivation on the same share farming principle as in vogue with other parts of the old estate, and carries a flock of 6,000 crossbreds. After having seen active service in South Africa and served in India as a lieutenant in the British Army, Mr. William McCulloch is elected to settle down here. In 1937, H.L.M. Beggs took occupation of the property and his daughter Mrs. Innes became the owner upon his death. H.L.M. Beggs was Hugh Lyons Montgomery Beggs. He was born in 1872 in Glen Thompson, Victoria, and he married Ethel Maud Murch in 1897 in Glen Thompson. His obituary said that he lived in the Western District all his life, and as a pastoralist he was a keen breeder of merino sheep. And he left a wife and 3 married daughters. Tessie was Mrs. Gordon Stewart, Doris Mrs. John Cayle, and Mabel Mrs. Richard Innes. It passed from Richard and Mabel Innes to Mr. and Mrs. W.J. Spittle and subsequently to W.R. Shaw. And I'll put photos of the Woodlands homestead on the Facebook page so you can see how grand it was and still is.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.